These parts are for the rudder case, which is the enclosure that secures the top part of the rudder and also allows the rudder and the tiller to kick up the way small boat rudders do. So these two plywood panels came the way you see them. This epoxy is filling in 4 holes, 2 on each side. These are taped on the bottom side and just overfilled with this epoxy that I'll sand smooth. And this piece of 18 millimeter Meranti plywood goes between those two plywood panels as a spacer. And this is the same material the rudder is made out of. But in order for the rudder to fit, this needs to be thickened. So there's 3 layers of glass on here, 2 layers of 6 ounce and 1 layer of 4 ounce to give it the thickness required to give the rudder a little space to move inside of this when it's assembled. These are just early pre-assembly steps that I could do while I was killing time and to stay ahead. And the next time I have fiberglass going, there's a couple more steps I can do to these pieces. These small rudder case parts have a couple other steps that I could do first. With those holes filled on the inside faces of the rudder case, I applied 1 layer of 4 ounce cloth. It's okay that it doesn't cover the bottom tip. It says so in the book. I suppose if I'd known when I cut this glass, I might have cut it an extra inch to cover it, but they say it doesn't matter. And that's fine with me. And then this little spacer, I applied 1 layer over this curved edge. It wraps just around under the bottom. It doesn't cover the whole bottom edge, the straight edge. But this is just for protection. It's 4 ounce cloth. The next day I trimmed the excess glass from these rudder case parts. The edge of the spacer here, just trimmed the overhang, and then the 2 flat panels. I trimmed the fiberglass from these rudder case pieces and block sanded the glass flat side here. This fiberglass actually isn't really cured enough to sand, so I'm going to sand that again in another day or two. And also trimmed and sanded this spacer piece, which is going to go in here, something like that, between the 2 pieces. That'll happen just a bit later. I need to get the rudder finished first because I need to make sure the rudder, as it's finished, will actually fit in here. This is supposed to be wide enough to allow that, but if it's not, or if it's too wide, then I'll have to block sand it down or add more material to make it fit better. So that'll happen once the glassing and all the fill coating and gloss coating on the rudder is all done. After some final prep, I glued the rudder case parts together. Before I glued them, I drilled out these 2 epoxy-filled holes with a 1/4 inch bit. I clamped both of these side pieces together and drilled them both at the same time so that those align together. The bottom hole here is where the rudder gets pinned. The top hole is the pin hinge for the tiller. This is glued together with epoxy with this spacer in between. This is that funny shaped piece of plywood with fiberglass on one side. Before I glued it, I did check the fit of the rudder. And since everything looked good, I proceeded with gluing. I made sure when gluing to clean up all the epoxy from inside there. I used a brush to reach in there and pull it out so there's no epoxy left at that seam. And then at the top edge here where the tiller is going to attach, I kind of formed a little fillet. It's not a huge one, but there is a little fillet in there, way in there. So that's the rudder case. We'll let that cure overnight. Oh, and here's the reason why it doesn't matter that the tips of the inside of the plywood panels are not glassed. It's because they're completely covered by this spacer when it's glued together. So I questioned why that didn't matter, and this is why it doesn't matter, because they're not exposed at all. Here's the completed rudder case. I've just put 1 coat of epoxy on it. I built this little handle that fits in there snugly so that I could turn this around and do all the surfaces. at one time. I'll clamp this onto the bench when I'm done. To get to this point, after I glued up the 3 parts, I block sanded, especially this forward edge and this area where the spacer is. Block sanded that nice and flat, cleaned up all the edges, sanded the faces, put a round over on all these sides, and a very small one on the inside, and then sanded it all with fine sandpaper. And this is the first of a few epoxy coats that will go on here. This handle idea came from the book, and it works great. So I'll do a few more coats of epoxy on this. Sanding is needed in between so that it ends up nice and smooth. This is the tiller and tiller extension. The tiller came in a rectangular blank with a scribed line on both sides, which I jigsawed off. This is the offcut here. But you can see how this was once a kind of a rectangular blank. So I shaped it according to the lines on it and sanded it smooth, and this is the net result. Nice mahogany tiller. And the tiller extension came as you see it here. I've just sanded it lightly, and these will get finished in some way. Here are the various rudder parts after some varnish. I did 6 coats of varnish on the tiller here over a series of days, and the tiller extension. I also put a couple coats on this rudder case, which was epoxy coated, but I thought it would need some protection and just spruce it up. But anyway, these are all set, ready for final assembly. I spent a little time doing the final assembly on this rudder, which included installing these 2 pintles. There were scribe marks in the case underneath here that helped align them where they're supposed to go. And otherwise I just followed the directions and installed them. These screws are installed in epoxy so they can't leak. There's a slightly longer pin on the lower side and a shorter one on top, and that enables it to be removed. You start the lower pin and then twist in the top pin and lower it down. There's a carriage bolt that holds the rudder itself in. I squared up the round hole like this. I squared it up to accept the carriage bolt. Then on the opposite side there's this knob, so you can adjust it, and that allows you to tilt up this rudder blade. I can't do it one-handed, but that's nice and easy. Then you just tighten that down. It'll hold it either in the up position or the sailing position like it is now. So that's pretty neat. That all worked well. The only step left with this is actually installing the gudgeons on the boat, and that'll happen after the hull is painted. So it's not quite ready for that yet. At the same time, with a little epoxy that I had left, I installed this hold down on the dagger board. And then there's a corresponding part to this that'll get installed on the deck a little bit later, but this is set into a drilled hole with epoxy, and I have it sitting here on edge just so that it can cure without the epoxy running out. And you'll see the other parts of that soon enough. So that's where we are on the foils. Basically done. Just some final installation steps left. The final step for this rudder was to install the pindles and gudgeons on the transom, and I laid these out before I painted the boat, but held off installation until now. So these are installed in the proper places according to the book. To determine the height, I put a block under the tiller, and that held everything at the right height, so I could lay out these pintles according to the gudgeons on the transom according to where the pintles were on the rudder. And then this little hold down clamp that keeps it from lifting up when sailing. The top screws, because of the outboard mount modification, do not get through bolted. They're just screwed into that plywood. The remaining stuff is through bolted, except the outer screws and the lower gudgeon, which go into the sides of the seats here. Tiller extensions held onto the tiller with a little piece of bungee. And that's the arrangement there. It's a nice knob here. I put some grease on the threads so that you can tilt up the rudder blade, kick it up for beaching or whatever you want to do. Put it down in sailing position and tighten that knob. It's got a carriage bolt, so the head can't spin, theoretically. But there you have it. Rudder, tiller extension, all installed.